Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. As today, we look at people who increasingly opposed slavery in the United States and those who increasingly came to defend it. Now, slavery had existed in the English colonies that became the United States since 1619 and became important after Bacon's rebellion in Virginia and the colonization of Carolina by Caribbean planters in the late 1600s. In different regions, of course, slaves worked in different ways. Most were employed in agriculture, whether growing food on the estates of the patroons in New York, growing tobacco in the Chesapeake, or raising rice in the Deep South. Others, however, were craftsmen or house servants. On tobacco plantations, slaves typically worked in the gang system, in which gangs of slaves worked specified shifts under the control of an overseer or driver. Their shifts were as long as they could physically bear, and different gangs were composed of slaves of similar strength, so a gang of strong workers could work longer at a more difficult task than a gang of weaker ones. Slaves under this system, of course, had little free time of their own, as they were worked as long as they could stand. It was viewed as a particularly harsh system, even within the harsh system of slavery. As tobacco plantations declined in profitability, and smaller gangs or fewer gangs were needed, extra slaves were often sold, even if that meant breaking up families. Now, on the rice plantations of the Deep South, slaves typically worked according to the task system, in which different slaves or groups of slaves were assigned a particular task which they had to work at until it was finished. Now, sometimes this made for very long and punishing hours during planting time or harvest time, but other times it allowed for a fair amount of free time in the evening and allowed some flexibility, sometimes quite a bit of flexibility, as to how a task was completed as long as it was completed. Because the task system could allow more free time than the gang system, slaves employed in this way often grew their own gardens, sometimes sold surplus produce or traded it away, and in general could have stronger communities and stronger families, as they had more time to spend together. Although, while they may have had stronger families, slave marriages were generally not recognized under the law. Family connections didn't count for much if a master decided to sell a slave. Now, there were laws to protect slaves, not many to be sure, and most were passed not so much to protect the slaves in their own right as to protect the value of the property of their owners. But there were laws, for example, in many places forbidding masters from freeing slaves who were old or ill or infirm. In other words, to keep slave owners from freeing slaves who were no longer productive but whom they didn't want to feed anymore. And laws like this were often followed, although not always. Slaves could look forward to a few holidays, although only a very few. Christmas, for example, was always a day off. Slaves were given a new suit of clothes and typically a gift of liquor to let them celebrate. And such holidays were rare, especially for the field hands. And who worked in the fields. Again, some slaves did work as house servants, either in the homes of plantation owners who had many slaves, or in some cases were the only slaves a family might own. In general, this was viewed as a higher status among slaves. And house servants' treatment, food, and shelter were generally better, although this was not guaranteed. And of course, female house servants, even more than other female slaves, had to worry about the unwanted attention of male members of their owner's family. It was pretty much impossible to say no, resulting in a large population of mulatto or mixed-race children. And these mulatto children remained slaves thanks to the one-drop rule, declaring that even one drop of black blood left someone black, and thus bound as a slave. And other slaves were craftsmen, perhaps working on a large plantation, building or fixing things, or perhaps working in a shop in town. Those who worked in a shop made a profit for their master's businesses. Even some plantation owners rented out their skilled slaves on short or long-term contracts. You might want a blacksmith around, but you don't need him every day. In some cases, slaves who made money for their masters as craftsmen were allowed to keep a certain amount of their income for themselves. And incidentally, craftsmen and house servants were the main types of slaves found in the North before slavery was abolished there, although certainly some did work in the fields, again, particularly in New York. By the time the Constitution was written in 1787, slavery seemed to be in the decline. Of course, ideological opposition to it existed in all 13 states that had just declared their beliefs that all men are created equal. And a number of northern states had already begun plans of gradual emancipation, while slavery had been excluded from any new states that might be created from the Northwest Territory. The importation of slaves to the United States was outlawed in 1808, the earliest date it was constitutionally possible to do so. And the British Royal Navy had already begun trying to stop the transatlantic slave trade, the British Empire having declared the transatlantic slave trade illegal for everybody, not just the British, in 1807. And economically, in the 1780s, slavery seemed to be less important too, especially in tobacco-growing areas, where tobacco was exhausting the land, and overplanting was producing lower prices for tobacco. Many tobacco planters were looking for new things to grow. George Washington and some other Virginians began switching to growing wheat, or at least thought about it. Indeed, the McCormick Reaper would be invented not in the Midwest, but in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, although the McCormick Company soon relocated to Chicago. Because wheat production was less labor-intensive than tobacco cultivation, Virginia, the largest slave-owning state of all, considered abolishing slavery in the late 1700s. And slavery was a potential threat to American virtue. Owning slaves was not just bad for slaves, but also bad for their owners, at least according to some writers. Thomas Jefferson said that because slavery required slave owners to exercise brutality over their slaves, it tended to make them brutal as well. The former slave, Frederick Douglass, described how he had once been bought by a man whose wife had never owned slaves, and at first treated him very kindly, but over time the inherent tyranny of the slave system transformed her from a very kind to a very harsh mistress. Another former slave, Booker T. Washington, later said that white people could not hold black people in a ditch without getting down in the ditch with them. Furthermore, a large servile underclass was not conducive to Republican virtue, as only independent citizens could be counted on to vote in a disinterested way. Slavery was even a threat to security, as the danger of a slave uprising was always in the back of the minds of slave owners, particularly after the Haitian Revolution, even though actual slave revolts in America were very rare. Thomas Jefferson compared having a large population of slaves to holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't dare let it go. But all this would change in 1793 with the invention of the cotton gin. With the processing of cotton now possible on a large scale, thousands of acres of land were devoted to growing cotton, an unpleasant and labor-intensive practice best suited for slaves, at least in the minds of free men. And these slaves typically worked in a gang system, the harsh system used on the tobacco plantations of Virginia. Work on a big cotton plantation was considered the worst kind of work a slave could do in the United States. So that slaves in the upper South, where cotton was rarely grown, were often seen as having it good, or at least better, than slaves in the deep South. But the fact is, as farms there were less profitable in many cases, there was not always the need to have that many slaves, especially on smaller farms, which again were often thought of as being better than a big plantation, but not necessarily, as extra slaves might be sold down the river to make money for their owners, to reduce the expense of unnecessary mouths to feed, or sometimes even as punishment. This became a major source of income for slave owners in parts of the Upper South, and this internal slave trade more than made up for the end of the international slave trade. Indeed, some large slave owners were happy to see the international slave trade end because it meant the slaves they already owned effectively increased in value. So, after the invention of the cotton gin, Southern states would cling more strongly than ever to slavery, for both economic and social reasons. Although, of course, this cotton was not used for the most part in the South, but went to feed the cotton mills, produced by the Industrial Revolution in the North and in Britain. Its use in the North and sale to Britain led to America's great economic boom in the mid-1800s. After 1840, cotton accounted for over half the value of all American exports. 75% of British cotton came from America in the 1840s. Southerners were so confident in the importance of cotton, some described it as white gold. While in 1858, South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond would say that cotton is king, believing that cotton gave the South so much economic and political power that the United States and even the British governments would have to give in to Southern demands. And so the wealth that slavery brought to the South created an aristocracy of sorts, as only a few Southerners had the wealth to invest in the land and slaves needed to operate a large plantation. In 1850, only 1,733 families owned more than 100 slaves each, and they formed the basis of the political, economic, and cultural leadership of the South. And if some people had argued in the past that slavery undermined Republican virtue, some Southerners pointed to the Roman Republic and its many slaves as evidence that slavery and republicanism could go together. Indeed, it could free the slave-owning class from manual labor, so they could devote their time to culture and philosophy and politics. Indeed, many of America's great early leaders were slave owners, as they had the time to devote their lives to public service because someone else was serving them. Other Southerners came to see themselves in kind of the Romantic age of the 1800s as preserving a medieval society of gallantry and honor. One reason dueling remained prevalent in the South long after it did in the North was because some saw it as a modern continuation of medieval jousting. Indeed, Mark Twain would later blame the entire Civil War on Southerners reading too much historical fiction by Sir Walter Scott, convincing Southerners of the 19th century that they were a new generation of knights. But even these lords of the manor had problems, as they were often in debt to the bankers who helped them buy the land and the gins for their plantation, as well as the slaves, and to the agents who traded the cotton. Indeed, the real money was not really in owning a cotton plantation, but in being the first person into a new area who could buy up the land cheap and then sell that land to aspiring planters. And there was also a lot of travel involved in the plantation business, as plantation owners would often be away in New Orleans or Memphis or elsewhere at the major cotton trading centers. And so their wives often ran plantations, supervising everything from the kitchen and gardens to the account books and the overseers who managed the slaves, so that white women had a very important role in this system as well. In some ways socially limited, in other ways very powerful. And so invested in maintaining their superiority over their black slaves. But even if there were fewer than 2,000 families owning over 100 slaves each, there were many other whites who supported the system as well. Certainly a slave owner with 98 slaves may not have fallen into that 1,700 and some, but was still quite wealthy. But there were many other small slave owners who owned perhaps a few slaves, one or two or a dozen or so. Indeed, before removal, and actually after removal as well, some Cherokee Indians had owned slaves. In addition to 17,000 Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, there were 2,000 of their slaves. In a few places, primarily Louisiana, where racial views were a little bit different thanks to the French influence. Even some free black people owned slaves. At any given point, at least 1/4 of Southerners owned at least one slave. Although not all Southerners who owned a slave always did so. Slave owning was a status one might lose or gain as one's fortunes changed, so that perhaps as many as half of all Southerners did own at least one slave at some point in their life. And therefore slave ownership was or seemed to be within the reach of almost anyone, so that even people who did not own a slave yet often still supported the system in hopes that one day they could be a part of it. And even for the poorest whites, having a lower class to look down on gave them some sense of value and identity, even a sort of equality with the plantation aristocracy. This is sometimes described as the mudsill theory of society. Somebody always has to be the mudsill, the lowest level, doing the worst work, and for whom everyone else can look down on. And whatever else could be said of a poor white person, at least he wasn't black. Although some were so poor that even slaves looked down on them, such as the clay eaters along the Mississippi River, who were so poor they actually ate clay. In particular, the poor mountain whites, the hillbillies of southern Appalachia and the Ozarks of Arkansas, and some other areas, rarely owned slaves, and none owned a large number of them, so that many of these hillbillies and some poor whites, rather than feeling a sense of membership in the white upper class, did resent what some called the slaveocracy that seemed to rule the South without much concern for poor whites, although in general they didn't like black people either. Of course, for many people, when you get right down to it, having somebody worse off than you, while it might feel good in a way, isn't really enough. And so many poor Southerners who did not think they could ever be part of this system left for the West, or at least the Midwest. So that by 1860, for every white Southerner, which is to say about 5.5 million in 1860, there were 4 million whites, about 22 million, in other parts of the country. So that the South's population stagnated. Not only because people left, but because not that many people came. While there were some major waves of immigration to the United States in the early and mid-1800s, for the most part, they tended not to go to the South. Those who hoped to become farmers could find cheap land in the Midwest. Those who wanted to or had to work in factories could find more jobs in the urban centers of the North. To be sure, there were some immigrants who settled in parts of the South. There was a major German community in Texas. Many Irishmen settled in New Orleans. But for the most part, immigrants went to the North. An Irishman in the South was most likely to be hired by a plantation owner who had a job too dangerous to risk a slave or a mule on. A slave or a mule costs money if something happens to him. But if an Irishman gets killed on the job, there's always more Irishmen. And so, with relatively few people available to work in factories, and not much social incentive for the wealthy to invest in factories, the South never developed much industry. There were a few exceptions, particularly in Middle Tennessee, where a number of iron works were developed. And there were iron industries in other parts of the South, some other industry too, but not much compared to the North. Even many of these industries employed slave labor. There's long been a theory that as a society becomes more industrial, slavery fades away. As slavery is only good, many say, for agricultural work, that moving into the industrial age naturally brings about an end to slavery. But again, the fact that slaves were widely used in what few industries were found in the South might be a point against that theory. For enslaving such a large number of people, by 1860, over 1/3 of Southerners were slaves, did require harsh treatment. Few people would willingly do the kind of work or the amount of work that most slaves had to do, so whipping was common. Other forms of mutilation were possible, branding, clipping of ears, or other things, although a slave was such a valuable investment, probably equivalent to a mid-range luxury car today, or an expensive piece of farm equipment or construction equipment. Indeed, from the point of view of a Southerner in the mid-1800s, a slave was an expensive piece of farm equipment. And so, one did not abuse a slave too badly because it was such a valuable investment. Furthermore, there were laws in the South, in every Southern state, known as slave codes to limit the rights of slaves. Slaves did have rights, but very few. In most places, they could not own firearms, could not travel off their owner's land without permission, could not meet in large numbers after dark. In some cases, and a growing number of cases by the mid-1800s, they could not be taught to read. Slave marriages had no legal force and did not prevent the separation of families or the violation of slave women by their owners. Slaves could not typically testify in court or serve on juries, and while there were some legal protections against violence from white people who were not their owners, that was mainly to protect their owners' investment in them. Slaves did sometimes try to escape. All the penalties for doing so could be harsh. There were professional slave catchers to hunt down runaways. Their bloodhounds might maul or even kill them when trying to retake them. Even crossing state lines into supposedly free states was no guarantee of safety, as the Constitution required that fugitive slaves be returned to their masters, although never mentioning the word slave itself. And it's true that many northern states did not always enforce these fugitive slave laws. Recaptured runaways might be chained up for a long period once they got back home, or even caged up. They might have to work in heavy chains to make it hard to run and to make them uncomfortable as punishment. They might have a collar placed around their neck with bells or spikes on it to make it hard to run away again, as the bells would give away their location. The spikes might make it hard to run through the underbrush, and of course this was very uncomfortable and unpleasant to work or sleep in. Runaway slaves might be branded and are otherwise punished. For some slaves and former slaves, often escaped slaves, and anti-slavery whites did help runaways to escape in some cases, a system that eventually became somewhat formalized, although not too much, so participants could not give others away, as the Underground Railroad, often using the language of actual railroads as code. Those who helped runaway slaves along the Underground Railroad were nicknamed conductors. A safe place to stay was a station. One of the most famous conductors was the escaped slave Harriet Tubman, known as the Black Moses, who helped lead escaped slaves out of eastern Maryland to freedom in Pennsylvania. And to be fair, the Underground Railroad was much more effective at helping runaways escape the Upper South than the Deep South. Much easier to get from Maryland to Pennsylvania than to escape from central Alabama. Perhaps my favorite story of escape is that of Henry Brown, who managed to, with the help of anti-slavery friends, mail himself in a box from Richmond, Virginia, to Philadelphia, to an anti-slavery society there, where his crate was opened upon arrival in 1849, getting him the nickname Box Brown. Other forms of resistance were more subtle. Slaves might work slowly or sloppily, deliberately breaking or wasting their master's goods or tools when they could, as a form of passive resistance. Many found some comfort in religion, as the Great Awakening, and especially the Second Great Awakening, affected black Southerners as well as whites. Now, black religion tended to focus on those aspects of the Bible that spoke of liberation, especially the story of Moses leading the Israelites to freedom out of slavery in Egypt. Of course, this made slave owners suspicious of black religious leaders. They often tried to prevent African Americans from preaching, preferring to have white ministers who would remind slaves of other parts of the Bible, telling slaves to obey their masters. Ephesians 6:5, for example. A fear of black preachers became particularly pronounced following events in August of 1831, when a black preacher named Nat Turner organized the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. In August of 1831, Turner's rebellion involved 70 slaves attacking white families in kind of central southern Virginia, killing over 50 white men, women, and children, many of them women and children, as men in the militia were off looking for Turner, leaving their own families undefended. Eventually they did catch Turner. They hanged him and about 20 of his followers. There were then riots in other parts of the South where angry whites killed at least 100 more black people, none of whom probably had anything to do with the rebellion. As a result of Turner's rebellion and Vesey's rebellion and fears of other rebellions, Southerners grew increasingly afraid of their own slaves. Indeed, Virginia briefly considered ending slavery again, but instead decided not to do so, and indeed made it illegal to free your slaves in Virginia unless you sent them out of the state. All Southern states made laws to control their slaves even tougher. It became illegal to send anti-slavery literature through the mail in much of the South, as a major campaign by Northern anti-slavery activists did try to do in 1835. Mail was searched and burned if it turned out to be anti-slavery material. In many states, it became illegal to teach slaves to read. In 1835, Tennessee wrote a new constitution, which addressed a number of issues in the state, but among other things, also took the right to vote away from free black men who had previously had it. And the harshness of this backlash made the anti-slavery movement in turn even more adamant in opposing slavery. One of the most outspoken members of the anti-slavery movement by the 1830s and 40s was John Quincy Adams, now a representative in Congress from Massachusetts. But as Northerners, at least some, attacked slavery more vocally, Southerners in turn began to defend their peculiar institution with increasing fire and hostility of their own. Now, and calling it a peculiar institution, Southerners did not mean slavery was unusual or strange, except that it was perhaps unique to them, an institution unique to the South at this point and necessary for them. Now, some Americans had opposed slavery since the colonial period, especially the Quakers of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. By 1804, every state north of the Mason-Dixon line, which is officially the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland, having been surveyed by two men named Mason and Dixon, but metaphorically is a division between North and South. And by 1804, every state north of this had passed laws bringing an end to slavery, in some cases immediately, in most on a gradual basis, leaving some people in slavery for years, even decades, but with most becoming free. The religious revivals of the early 1800s, particularly the Second Great Awakening, led to an increased moral opposition to slavery as well. The great preacher of the burned-over district, Charles Grandison Finney, became an early leader of the anti-slavery movement and helped train later anti-slavery leaders too. Now, many opponents of slavery in the late 17th, especially early 1800s, hoped that some form of compensated emancipation or moral pressure, moral suasion, they said, on slave owners might convince slave owners to voluntarily manumit their slaves. Manumission and being voluntarily freeing your own slaves. It was hoped that this would bring slavery to an end, and was the most appropriate way for it to end voluntarily, or again through compensated emancipation, with state governments or the U.S. government buying the slaves of slave owners and freeing them, as would eventually be done by the British Empire. Furthermore, many early opponents of slavery felt that once slaves were freed, they didn't exactly want them around. They were still very black, and being poor and uneducated might not be good citizens of a republic, so it'd be best if they would all leave, probably for Africa, possibly for Haiti, or somewhere in Central America, avoiding racial conflict and removing a large supply of unskilled workers who might be an economic problem. The first prominent anti-slavery group of this type was the American Colonization Society, formed in 1816. Many of its members were Quakers, or others opposed to slavery on religious grounds, but there were a number of members from the Upper South, slave owners from states where slavery was less profitable, who wanted some way to bring a gradual end to slavery. Henry Clay and James Monroe, both slave owners, were members because they saw slavery as economically unfeasible in the long run, at least in their home states where cotton was not grown. And their goal was to purchase slaves from their owners and transport them to Africa, where the American Colonization Society helped to create Liberia, the land of the free, with its capital at Monrovia, named for the first president of the American Colonization Society and fifth president of the United States, James Monroe. Liberia would have a flag that may look awfully familiar. They would have a currency known as the dollar. And long after the Whig Party vanished in the United States, the true Whig Party would remain the main political party in Liberia from 1878 to 1980. At least 15,000 freed slaves settled in Liberia in the mid-1800s, where in many cases they then subjugated the native tribes, leading to conflict between the Africans in Liberia and the African-American Africans in Liberia, tension that remains to this day. But even with 15,000 former slaves going to Liberia, that left millions of slaves in America, depending on other anti-slavery movements to gain them their freedom. And while we tend to associate the anti-slavery movement with the North, in fact, the very first dedicated anti-slavery newspaper was published by Elihu Embry, a Quaker living in Jonesboro, Tennessee. He initially called his newspaper the Manumission Intelligencer, but later renamed it the Emancipator, and starting in 1819. In 1822, Benjamin Lundy, a Quaker living in Greenville in East Tennessee, began to publish The Genius of Universal Emancipation. Indeed, there was a fairly strong anti-slavery movement in East Tennessee, although anti-slavery Tennesseans like Embry and Lundy and their friends were fairly moderate. They wanted state-legislated gradual emancipation, combined with moral pressure to convince slave owners that slavery was unchristian and un-American. And they too hoped to colonize the newly freed slaves to Haiti or Liberia. In the end, not much really was accomplished in terms of ending slavery in Tennessee, although East Tennessee was an important supporter of the Underground Railroad. But, as I already mentioned, following Turner's rebellion, anti-slavery movements in the South were weakened by the growing fear of slave rebellions and by increasing resentment of increasingly intrusive Northern opposition to slavery, which was also believed to be likely to incite further rebellions. Indeed, on New Year's Day, 1831, just a few months before Turner's rebellion, William Lloyd Garrison in Boston published the first issue of The Liberator, an uncompromising anti-slavery newspaper. When Turner's rebellion broke out later that year, some Southerners blamed Garrison for provoking it. The state of Georgia offered a $5,000 reward, probably close to $500,000 in today's money, if Garrison could be arrested and convicted for inciting murder. He was attacked many times over the course of his career, sometimes barely escaping with his life, and those attackers were almost always Northerners, angry that Garrison seemed to be stirring up trouble, with his controversial, even radical attacks on slave society. Indeed, he went so far as to call the U.S. Constitution itself a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because of those provisions within it that protected slavery. He would later suggest the North secede from the South to create a virtuous nation free from the sin of slavery. In 1833, Garrison helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society, along with Wendell Phillips of Boston, a man known as Abolition's Golden Trumpet, a man so opposed to slavery that he refused to eat sugar or wear cotton clothing because both were the products of slave labor. Sort of a vegan for slavery, I suppose. In 1835, William Lloyd Garrison published what was supposed to have been a private letter from Angelina Grimke, a South Carolina Quaker who privately opposed slavery. You're kind of having to oppose slavery pretty privately in South Carolina. Once her letter was published against her wishes, she and her sister Sarah Grimke soon moved north and became very prominent members of the anti-slavery movement and also the early women's movement. They wrote articles and gave speeches across the North. Sarah Grimke later married Theodore Weld, and the two of them and her sister published American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, a collection of first-hand accounts of slavery in 1839. Indeed, former slaves were among the most powerful spokesmen and sometimes spokeswomen for the anti-slavery cause, because their eloquence could demonstrate that black people could be the intellectual equals of whites, despite what many people claimed at the time. Indeed, the intellectual inferiority of African Americans was supposedly a justification for keeping them enslaved. One of these former slaves was Sojourner Truth, born in New York 2 years before that state began its program of gradual emancipation. She escaped from slavery in 1826 along with her infant daughter. She later sued to free her son, who was sold or nearly sold illegally to a Southerner. When New York had banned slavery after a certain point, it also banned the sale of slaves outside of New York, so that someone whose slave was about to become free could not be sold across state lines before that date came. This was the first time a black woman successfully sued a white man in America. And she had a very powerful argument against slavery, partly from a woman's point of view, pointing out that half of all slaves were women, many of whom did hard physical work and suffered degradation of many types in a society that claimed to protect women in their separate sphere, where, she said, is the gallantry of so many honorable American men when slave women were mistreated and forced to work as hard as any man. Indeed, she claimed a woman's role as a reformer, just as many white women did after the Great Awakening. Her most famous speech is known as "Ain't I a Woman?" Although in printings of this speech across the country, she was presented as speaking with poor grammar and a Southern dialect, which is inaccurate. Her English was very good, despite it being her second language, her first language being Dutch, having been born in rural New York. Whatever accent she had, it certainly wasn't Southern. The most famous former slave of all was Frederick Douglass, who escaped from Maryland in 1838 and began a public speaking career in 1841 that expanded into a writing career, starting with a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845. He eventually purchased his freedom and that of his family with the money he made from his writing, and his career was built on a lifelong love of learning, as he'd been taught to read, somewhat by a former owner, had even traded food to white children if they would teach him to read, even though it was illegal for them to do so. This devotion to education, his eloquent speaking and writing, and were further proof a black man could be the equal, at least, of a white man. But while some anti-slavery activists hoped that slave owners could eventually be persuaded by moral arguments to free their slaves, over time more and more of them began to feel they would have to seek a political solution to slavery. Dedicated anti-slavery societies, indeed whole parties, were founded and failed in the 1840s and 1850s, like the Liberty Party, founded in 1840, and the Free Soil Party, founded in 1848. Now, the growing anti-slavery movement was repeatedly thwarted by an increasingly active pro-slavery movement in the South, where John C. Calhoun and later other Southerners began to argue that slavery was not the necessary evil that even slave owners had long said it was, but rather not a necessary evil, but a positive good. Good for both slave owners and their slaves. Slavery, they said, was admirable. It offered the benefits of civilization and the Christian religion to the African savages brought to America, and provided more security to the slaves in the South than factory work did for the wage slaves in the North. Slavery might be hard, but slave owners loved their slaves. They took care of them, while Northern capitalists just sought to exploit their workers and cast them aside when they no longer needed them. Furthermore, slavery was sanctioned in the Bible, and through various passages describing slaves obeying their masters, and through a story even older. Back to the days of Noah, when, of course, the world was so wicked that it was entirely flooded, with God preserving only Noah and his family, and 2 of every animal, and some spares of the really good ones. When the flood waters receded, Noah planted grapes, and eventually he invented wine. Shortly after inventing wine, he invented passing out drunk naked. And while he lay naked in his tent with the tent flap open, one of his sons, Ham, walking by, saw his father lying there. And instead of closing the tent flap like a good boy, Ham went and got his brothers, Shem and Japheth, to point and laugh. Shem and Japheth, though, being good boys, instead of pointing and laughing, took a blanket and covered their father up, even walking backwards so they would not have to see his shame. When Noah finally sobered up, he cursed Ham, condemning him, or actually his son Canaan's descendants, to be the servants of Noah's other sons and their descendants. And it was believed that Noah's 3 sons became the ancestors of the 3 races of man. Shem was the ancestor of Asians, meaning primarily Middle Easterners. Japheth was the ancestor of Europeans. Ham, of course, was the ancestor of the African races. As one Southern writer put it, in jest, Noah meant to curse him blue, but overdid the thing and cursed him black. The curse of Ham, it was said, condemned Africans to serve the other races forever. But the truth was, slavery began to split many churches. As many Northerners had come to feel during the Second Great Awakening that slavery was a sin. While again, many Southerners used the Bible to justify slavery. The Methodists had begun as an anti-slavery denomination, but over time, some Southern Methodists came to accommodate themselves to slavery. The Methodists eventually split over this issue, as did the Baptists. All the Southern Baptists in the mid-1990s did come out and say slavery is, in fact, wrong. The Presbyterians split over the issue of slavery, too. There tend to be other debates behind these splits as well. At least among the Baptists, whether or not to support missionary societies was rather controversial. Again, many churches, although not all, split over the issue of slavery. The most outspoken supporters of slavery came to be known as fire eaters, who again described slavery as the South's peculiar institution, unique to their region and culture, something necessary and indeed for the best. In 1836, Southerners in the House of Representatives managed to pass the Gag Resolution. This gag rule, created in 1836, banned discussion of any anti-slavery topics in the House of Representatives for 8 years, until John Quincy Adams, one of its main targets, finally managed to have it repealed in 1844. John C. Calhoun tried to create a similar rule in the Senate, but was not successful there. And A growing number, although still probably a minority, of anti-slavery activists became outright abolitionists, demanding that slavery be outlawed across the country, not gradually wished away through moral argument, or gradual emancipation or colonization to some remote part of the earth. Most people, though, even people generally opposed to slavery, did see outright abolitionists as too radical and too likely to stir up trouble between North and South. Anti-slavery literature in the South was burned, but even in the North, abolitionists were sometimes attacked. The newspaper editor, Elijah P. Lovejoy, an abolitionist publisher, had his printing press destroyed 4 times and was eventually killed in 1837 in a gun battle trying to defend his printing press in the state of Illinois. Radicalism, like that of the abolitionists, many people felt, would endanger the Union by driving the South away or possibly pulling the North out, as William Lloyd Garrison suggested. Even into the 1850s, most opponents of slavery preferred to support the free soil movement, which accepted, in some cases very grudgingly accepted, but accepted the legality of slavery where it currently existed, but opposed its expansion into any new territories, especially those gained from Mexico in 1848.